Hello, fiendlings. How the hell are you? It's been a crazy week writing-wise, and every time I think I get closer to finishing Neptune's Scars, it grows. For better or worse, it's going to be the size of Derelict Destruction, or around there. Remember when I could write relatively short books? Good times. As of this recording, the Arrival audiobook still isn't available up at Audible. I'll put out a notice when it finally goes live. If you purchased a book during the Valentine's Day Massacre or decided to plow through them using KDP, I thank you. Also, thank you for the reviews and the comments. You have no idea how much they help sell the stories, keep my sanity, and show me you're enjoying the tale. As always, if you want to support the podcast, please consider becoming a member at patreon.com/Paul E Cooley, buymeacoffee.com/Paul E Cooley, or ko-fi.com/Paul E Cooley and get access to unpublished exclusive tales such as An Ancient Trap, as well as the archives for all my podcast novels, including the 2 unpublished black novels, Evolution and Oceania. Another way to support me and other creatives? Pimp our podcasts, recommend commercial-free media, and support your favorite indie artists. Not much else to add this week, so I'll leave you with this. Be safe, have a great week, and we'll talk again real soon. Here's episode 3 of The Black.
Chapter 2. Calhoun awoke to purple sky and he smiled at the porthole in his stateroom. The horizon wore a heavy suit of clouds, but the rising sun colored them in dark pastels. It was the kind of morning he lived for. The rig stank of diesel, grease, and metal. In other words, like every other rig on the planet. The breeze added the ocean's saltwater perfume to the mix. Once the purples faded to orange, Calhoun dressed and headed to the top deck after securing a cup of coffee. He stared out at the ocean. Below the grind and hum of the rig's engines, he could hear the rig crew working on the drill string. In an hour or so, they'd begin feeding the string down to the wellhead. Even before JP and Catfish had boarded the rig over a week ago, Vrabel and crew had started the process of prepping the site. They sunk the lines, an emergency cap, and other gear. All of it was sitting in over 30,000 feet of water. The trench didn't even have a name besides M2, but from the early seismic and magnetic surveys, they should be able to drill anywhere along its spine and find the black. Catfish had sent his AUVs down to film the bottom and ensure the equipment was where it was supposed to be. Simpson, the PPE vice president over the project, had told Calhoun Vrabel's crew was the best in the industry. Without any help from electronic surveillance, they'd managed to place the gear perfectly. He hated to admit it, but he was impressed. Vrabel might be an uptight asshole, but he knew what he was doing. It had taken the crew over 4 hours to perform the load out from the supply ship, the cranes running fast and efficiently. PPE had paid a lot of money to ensure they had the best personnel covering every aspect of the venture. Just getting the equipment on the rig should have taken at least 7 hours, but Vrabel's people had gotten it done in no time. Then they'd sacked out for a total of 6 hours before having breakfast and getting back to work. JP, Catfish, and Shauna had all turned in as soon as the crew was done. Calhoun had stayed up another 2 hours going over the AUV ROV reports and footage. 4 hours of sleep? Perfectly fine for the first day. If he was lucky, he'd get a hell of a nap once the drilling was up and running, at least after the first couple of hours. When a team drilled a test well, Calhoun wanted to be awake and apprised of every little detail. If anything went wrong, he wanted to know as soon as possible. The difference between hitting the sweet spot or drilling into a pocket of dangerous gas was pretty thin. Geologists and mudloggers constantly watched the readouts to ensure that didn't happen, but it was hardly real-time. Some of the engineering companies had spent millions and millions of dollars on creating real-time tools, sensors, and software to assist in decision-making, but it wasn't foolproof. Shauna had learned to trust her instincts more than any software or technology, and he trusted her. Between the two of them, they never made a mistake during drilling, at least not a fatal one. Bits break, machines malfunction, parts fracture. That was reality. When it happened, you fixed them and moved on. As long as you had a good design and a good plan, you could encounter anything and succeed. Unless, of course, the oil wasn't there. The seismic and magnetic surveys showed it was there. The only question was how much water sat below the surface and how sweet the crude was, but the surveys showed no echo from the water, and that was strange to say the least. It was that little detail that had excited PPE and Calhoun. If the trench was truly free from underground water, much less salt water, then it would be a unique offshore find. Processing the crude would be simple and inexpensive. He took a deep drag from the cigar and let the smoke sit in his mouth. Besides a good single malt, cigars were his only vice. When you spent most of your time drilling, smoking was a privilege. Long ago, he'd learned there was always at least one spot on the rig for the smokers. Larger rigs had more space. Something as small as the Leaguer only had the top deck. It would suck if there was a storm, but it was workable. He'd have to ration out his habit. It was going to be a long month, longer if they didn't find a strike and had to hunt for the sweet spot. But Shauna had a feeling. He had it too. This was going to be the big one, the big strike that he could retire on. He and Catfish could spend the rest of their lives designing better AUVs and ROVs. Shauna could go do, well, whatever she wanted. And JP? That bastard would probably move back to the Keys or maybe Hawaii and spend the rest of his days beneath the ocean. Calhoun heard a shout below decks and grinned. The roughnecks were doing their jobs. The drill string would be ready by late morning. And then, the fun would begin. Even high up on the bridge, he heard the pandemonium from the deck. Large men walked with wrenches the size of a baseball bat. Others dragged lines and cables. The machinery was getting going, and it wouldn't be long before the rig was in action. Vrabel sipped a cup of coffee. Dinner with Calhoun had been, well, interesting. They traded the usual war stories, but Calhoun had more than he did. The older engineer had been all over the world, including Algeria, Nigeria, and South Africa. Vrabel was thankful he'd never been to those hellholes. "Calhoun," Vrabel had said, "how the hell did a guy like you end up with JP and Catfish?" He said the last word with obvious distaste. Calhoun had laughed. "JP's the easy one. Met him while he was doing a demonstration on underwater demolition to put out well fires. Plus he did some work with Boots and Coots, so I'd heard of him. Didn't take long for him to decide to join up with me." The older man had paused and then tapped the table with his fingers. "Catfish?" He shook his head. "That bastard came to me." Vrabel raised his eyebrows. "Came to you?" "Yeah," Calhoun said. "About 15 years ago. I was giving a seminar on AUV technology and how it was the future. Some long-haired punk of a kid kept asking questions about artificial intelligence and automated sensor tech." He grinned. He was basically interviewing for a job, or so he thought. "He wasn't with anyone?" Vrabel asked and sipped his coffee. Calhoun shook his head. "Catfish bought a ticket to the conference representing his own company, Catfish Technologies. He had a degree in engineering from Houston and thought he was hot shit." Calhoun's Cheshire grin returned. "And he was. I had no idea how to do what I was proposing. I mean, I knew how to put the AUVs together. That's pretty damn simple. But the programming?" He tinted his hands and rested his chin on them. "That's mostly Catfish." "That's pretty standard stuff now," Vrabel said. "I've had ROVs on my rigs for years." Calhoun nodded. "And a lot of the patents used in them came from the work that long-haired punk did." Calhoun sipped from his half-empty glass of iced tea. "The other half? Those are mine," Calhoun smiled. "Besides, whatever AUVs or ROVs you've worked with before are nothing like the ones we brought." Calhoun stabbed his index finger on the table. "Our stuff is like nothing you've ever seen before, and tomorrow you will understand why." "Bullshit," was what Vrabel had wanted to say. Instead, he just nodded and let the engineer talk. Simpson had told Vrabel over and over again that Calhoun's tech was the best in the industry. "Come hell or high water," the executive had said in his thick Texas drawl, "he'll find the oil, and we're all going to make a lot of money." Vrabel finished his coffee and placed the cup on the console. The crew was working fast. Instead of fighting with the drill bit, Calhoun's new design coupled easily. Maybe the old man wasn't so full of shit after all. "Deck to Chief," the radio squawked. He glared at the speaker. The voice was most likely Catfish's. He reached out and took the silver mic off the stand. Vraybell here. That you, Catfish? Yes, sir. He sounded respectful, but Vraybell could sense that snot-nosed attitude just below it. Wanted to get permission from you to take out the AUVs. We want to get them diving. Vraybell smiled. For once, the little shit was asking for permission. Guess Calhoun made good on his promise. Aye. You're a go to take out the Zodiac for tow. Any idea how long? There was a pause. We'll need to get each AUV about 500 yards out from the rig, and we'll need to do it one at a time. So it's going to take a couple of hours. Understood. You're a go. Let me know when you're done. Aye, aye, Catfish said. Vraybell put the mic back in its clip. At least JP and Catfish were finally going to get some work done. More importantly, they would be off the rig. He stood up and stared down at the deck. The drill string was dropping through the slot. A 50-foot section of steel was slowly lowered into the hole before another section was attached. Vraybell had never seen a drill string put together with pipe sections this large. They were usually 46 feet long or less, but these were a new design, Calhoun's. Vraybell had been uneasy when he'd first been told they were going to use new gear, new tech, new everything. There were many horror stories of new designs being tried out on exploratory rigs with disastrous results. Drilling was dangerous enough without taking components out of the lab and trying to apply them directly to the real world. But Calhoun's reputation was golden. The man's tech had never been blamed for an accident. Whatever new invention he applied to a new well, it just plain worked, or so the stories went. Vraybell believed in mitigating risk. After you see a man lose his hand while trying to do the most simple task on a rig, you realize just how dangerous drilling is. You learned diligence. He'd worked rigs where the chiefs pushed the crew too hard. When a crew felt rushed, they made mistakes. Mistakes meant injuries or death. Regardless of how hard Simpson or Calhoun wanted to hit the well site, no matter how much oil might be beneath the surface, Vraybell wasn't going to push his people. He and Gomez had worked together for over 5 years. The tool pusher knew how to take his time. If there was a delay, so be it. As a rig chief, Vraybell had never lost a crew member, and he wasn't planning on putting that track record in danger. The crew worked in 12-hour shifts for weeks at a time. This far out from land, it wasn't the normal 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off schedule. It was 3 weeks on, 3 weeks off. Some of his people wouldn't even bother going home. They'd just head to the mainland, stay in one of the company's bungalows, and hit the streets. The family men would spend nearly 36 hours getting home, and after 2.5 weeks, spend another 36 hours getting back to the rig. It was a rough life, but they were paid well for it. Vraybell picked up his coffee cup and headed to the back wall. He'd plastered topographical maps constructed from the AUV surveys to the west wall. Several safety and procedure signs covered the south and east walls. The north wall? That was the coffee station. He slotted a pod in the machine, pressed the brew button, and waited for the black coffee to drop into the cup. By lunchtime, the crew would probably have most of the drill string assembled. After that, they would spend the afternoon readying for a core sample. Vraybell had half a mind to postpone that until tomorrow. He'd worked the crew hard the last 24 hours. Between offloading the supply ship and getting the drill string ready, they'd not had enough rest. The machine burped a cloud of steam as it finished brewing the coffee. He picked up the cup and sipped. Perfect, as always. He turned to the bridge windows and stopped in mid-sip. Down on the deck, Calhoun stood off to the side of the drill crew. He watched as the crew put together the drill string, a strange smile on his face. Vraybell groaned. The rumors were true. Vraybell had heard Calhoun wasn't the typical engineer. Instead of sitting in the bowels of the rig watching TV and waiting for someone to tell him there was a problem, the man supposedly walked to the deck before drilling started and during. He liked to be down with the crew in case there was a problem. One more thing I have to worry about, Vraybell said aloud. If PPE's star engineer was injured at all during this trip, Vraybell would no doubt lose his job. But Calhoun was far enough away from the crew. He was near the steel shelter in case something bad happened. If there was an accident powerful enough to take him out, the entire crew would be gone anyway. Vraybell shook off a chill and took another sip of his coffee. Yep, that was that. As soon as the drill string was ready, he was sending the crew on break. A long one. He talked to Gomez at lunch and have him choose a skeleton crew to monitor for problems. Calhoun could wait. PPE could wait. He had a bad feeling, and until it went away, he wanted to take every precaution possible. Catfish sat at his console. 2 energy bar wrappers and 3 empty cans of energy drink sat on the desk next to the screen. Bright blue-white light illuminated the nearby workstations. When Catfish had first seen his work area lit up like a cube farm, he'd retrieved a stepladder and unscrewed all the bulbs directly above him. It didn't completely diminish the brightness, but it left his workstations in a pool of twilight. Any idiot knew that fluorescents were bad for long-term computer work. They glared off the screens, even if they were matted, and made for tired, strained eyes. Catfish preferred to work in the dark. All his console backgrounds were black with green text. The custom software he'd created for AUV, ROV control and monitoring was fully color customizable. He'd created this theme, however, for himself. The 4 27-inch screens created a panorama of alert and tracking data. The first 2 screens were lit with AUV, ROV readings, while the third and fourth were for mission commands and navigation programming. The 5 AUVs were still diving. He'd lose communication with them very soon. When he and JP first arrived, the X-SEAL dove beneath the rig and installed the remote radio Wi-Fi sensors. For a time, the extra bandwidth and radio reception would help Catfish correct the dive characteristics. But once the AUVs went below 15,000 feet, the reception would be spotty at best. After 20,000, he'd be lucky if he managed to get a status ping. The ROVs were different. They were attached to the rig via specialized tethers that allowed for near real-time control and communication. The increase in bandwidth meant the ROV cameras could send actual video, albeit only 10 frames per second, at ridiculous depths. The only problem? The tethers had to be watched and constantly messaged. You had to spend a lot of time controlling an ROV to make sure it didn't get wrapped around the drill string or the tether didn't get fouled by subsea fauna and flora. Catfish loved driving the ROVs. It was like a video game where you had to incorporate the sensor data to decide which move to make. The yaw, pitch, and throttle controls were affixed to a metal plate next to his workstation. Another of Calhoun's inventions, it allowed Catfish to control the ROV the same way he played actual video games. It was slick, and every other ROV driver in the industry would no doubt salivate and envy. If, that is, they ever saw it. Prototypes. Everything on this mission was new gear. It had been tested in the lab, field tested in the Gulf of Mexico, and then finally brought out here. The difference? He'd never pushed the AUVs or the ROVs below 10,000 feet of water. Thus, the week-long break-in. Catfish had tested each of the robots by sending them down to the trench floor. The AUVs had to travel roughly 30,000 feet before they neared bottom. He'd played with the ROV controls to get a feel for how sluggish they were at the maximum depth of 20K. Because of the delay between the electronic impulses that traveled down the wires and the return signal from the ROV, you had to think a second or two ahead of what you did. Otherwise, you'd have to overcompensate, and overcompensating could lead to a damaged ROV or worse. R3, his favorite of the ROVs, was diving steadily and without issue. The video feed displayed a vampire squid jetting through the water. The strange-looking creature had no doubt been attracted by the ROV's headlamp. It kept circling the machine, unsure if any part of the robot was edible. Catfish smiled. The ROV was already 18,000 feet below the ocean surface. At that depth, all was darkness with a near-freezing temperature. The only creatures that plumbed those depths were ancient evolutionary anomalies. He'd never seen a vampire squid at this depth. They usually stayed out of the lower midnight region of the ocean, but here it was. Catfish made a mental note. NOAA would want to know any biological specimens he found during the dive and exploration, and he always made sure to send them reports out of courtesy. After all, their research money is what had uncovered this find. An alert window popped up on the left screen. He glanced over at it without turning his head. AUV-1 was out of contact range. A second later, the other AUVs followed suit. They descended into deep midnight and wouldn't be heard from again until their return to the surface. When the dunce lost contact, Catfish sighed deeply before turning back to the ROV feed. He was nearing its design threshold for pressure. If he went another 3,000 feet down, he'd be risking the robot. Ever since Mass U had lost an AUV due to a decompression incident years ago, Catfish had worried he'd make the same mistake. All it took was one minuscule air bubble to be in the wrong place, and all the design in the world couldn't save you. Your $2 million toy would turn into a storm of undersea shrapnel. Catfish stopped the ROV's descent and set it to hover. According to the coordinates, it would be well out of the way of the drill string when it dropped. But that fucktard Vrabel had postponed finishing up drill string construction until tomorrow's morning shift. Apparently, Vrabel was worried about fatigue. Catfish harumphed. "Sleep when you're dead, fuckers," he said aloud. He took another sip of his fourth energy drink and realized his foot was tapping. Too much caffeine, he thought. Maybe I should get some sleep too. He'd programmed the AUVs to start taking video and sensor readings near the wellhead. They would carry out their missions even though the drill string hadn't yet been fully deployed. He'd have to wait until they surfaced or came in radio range to send them back on the same programmed routes. He'd no idea what the dunce would do. Number 5 had given him so much trouble with navigation, it would be a miracle if he'd finished working out the bugs. Catfish checked his watch. It was after 5 in the afternoon. Vrabel had announced over the radio that everyone was to get rack time and they would resume building the string at 0600. That would let the night shift do light duty around the rig and go to sleep just as the morning crew came on. Catfish's stomach grumbled. It had been too long since he'd eaten. Period. When he and JP had taken the AUVs out into the ocean, they'd just had breakfast. After 3 hours of towing them offshore and setting the robots in motion, Catfish felt exhausted and starved. But instead of taking a break, he'd wanted to jump in on the monitoring as soon as they'd stowed the Zodiac. Number 5 hadn't given them any trouble when they put her in the water. She started her dive immediately as programmed, but diving had never been the problem with that one. Catfish rubbed his eyes and his stomach grumbled again. The ROV was stationary in the water. He thought about putting it on autopilot so it would stay in its position, but instead he chose to bring it back up. He could check the sections of the drill string that had been deployed. If nothing else, he'd be able to update Calhoun and Vrabel if he found a problem. He took his hands from the controls, reached in a drawer, and pulled another protein bar out of the box. The wrapper said chocolate peanut butter, but it still tasted like ass. Oh well, it would have to do until the ROV was put away for the night. The deepest parts of the ocean are known as lower midnight. No sunlight from the surface reaches these depths. Born in darkness and near freezing temperatures, the sea life is an evolutionary marvel that may very well be older than the dinosaurs. Some fish survive the incredible pressures of the deep, only to rise to the surface. No one knows why these strange creatures choose to leave their birthplace and struggle against the pressure to taste the sunlight. Their bodies have molded themselves to not only survive the unfathomable pressure, but somehow reorganize their internal ballast bladders and float to the warm ocean surface. Evolutionary marvel or prehistoric cast-off, these creatures are remarkable in their abilities and design. Like the creatures it encountered at the extreme ocean depths, AUV-5 had been designed much the same way. As it dove from the surface to reach lower midnight, it expelled every last remnant of air. If a single air bubble remained trapped inside the machine's body, the incredible atmospheric pressure of lower midnight would result in catastrophic decompression. Its twin ballasts, looking like steel remora fish attached to its undercarriage, were filled with seawater to accelerate its dive to the ocean floor. When it was time to surface, the AUV would open a control valve and expel the contents. The sudden buoyancy of the tanks would aid its ascent. Number 5's programming led it into slow, lazy circles around the area where the drill string should have been. The other AUVs were further off, their cameras pointed straight at a target that wasn't there. Number 5's thermal imaging and blue light cameras snapped the programmed 10 frame per second video and stored them on an internal SSD array. It would continue doing this until it ran out of space or it was time to surface. The yellow-painted robot, invisible in the pitch-black depths, continued its descent until it reached the wellbore. It studied the Spud site. Number 5 pinged the area, analyzed the data, and ensured to the best of its ability that the readings were as expected. The drill string hadn't yet been dropped, so it found no sign of the metal pipe or the blowout preventer. Normally, if it found a problem, its subroutine to ascend until it was in radio range would kick in. But Catfish had programmed the robots to ignore a missing drill string. Number 5 was as content as a machine could be. None of its warning or emergency routines were running. As long as that was the case, it would wait and monitor. As the SSD filled with video, the AUV fired off another sonar burst at the rock and sand surrounding the Spud site. The return was strange. AUV marked the reading, but analyzing the data was far above its pay grade. The robot continued pinging the area as it looked for other anomalies. Perhaps the strange echo was a glitch in its system, or maybe something below the rock moved. Either way, it continued its pinging, gathering as much data as possible. Provided nothing of import occurred, it wouldn't begin its trip to the surface until 0400. It continued checking its internal clock, counting off the seconds until the ascent program began.